Imagine a quiet autumn morning in the Sicilian port of Messina. The sun throws a soft glow over the harbor as fishermen bring in their haul of fish. One of them looks up and sees sails on the horizon, Genoese ships arriving at the shore. He wipes his hands, raises a hand, and waves, but nobody waves back. Curious, he steps closer, boards one of the vessels, and climbs the creaking wooden stairs, calling out. Then the stench overwhelms him. Thick, rotten, unnatural. Bodies lie scattered across the deck like broken dolls. Some are already dead, others still move weakly. Their skin is marked with black blotches. Their limbs are swollen in grotesque shapes. Terrified, he stumbles backward. These ships have carried more than trade goods. They bring death itself. In the coming months, entire towns will vanish. Between 75 and 200 million people will perish. This is the Black Death, the plague of the Middle Ages that wiped out half of Europe. But before we follow its dark road westward, we must first look at the civilization it was about to strike. The Europe of 1340 stood at the peak of medieval success, a continent filled with prosperity, confidence, and rapid demographic growth. This was not the primitive Dark Ages of popular imagination, but a cultured society that produced some of mankind's most enduring achievements. Since the year 1000, the population had nearly tripled, reaching about 75 million people. Large cities thrived along the trade routes. Paris may have held around 200,000 inhabitants, larger than any city in Europe since the fall of Rome. The Gothic cathedrals rising high into the sky represented not just religious devotion, but the very height of engineering skill. Buildings so magnificent that some believed only divine help could explain them. Medieval Europeans thought they had the world understood. The thinkers of their era had built what seemed like a complete system of knowledge. God's creation, they believed, followed fixed rules that the human mind was able to grasp. Thomas Aquinas had recently combined ancient Greek philosophy with Christian teaching, producing a framework that appeared to explain everything from the movement of the stars to the purpose of human existence. Universities in Paris, Oxford, and Bologna attracted Europe's brightest minds, confident in their mastery of divine truth. Yet beneath this wealth lay dangerous weaknesses. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 had already shown Europe's fragility, as climate change and failed harvests killed perhaps 10% of the population. More ominously, Europe's very success created the conditions for disaster. Dense urban populations, long trade routes, and close human-animal contact in crowded cities. This was a civilization convinced it possessed the answers to life's greatest questions, a dangerous confidence soon to face its ultimate test. While Europe basked in its golden age, in the vast steppes of Central Asia, death was awakening among the windswept mountains of what we now call Kyrgyzstan. Archaeological discoveries trace the origin of the Black Death to the Tian Shan Mountains, where plague genomes identify the birthplace of the most devastating pandemic in human history. In the early decades of the 14th century, Yersinia pestis mutated into a form more lethal to humans, changing from a local disease of wild rodents into a world-conquering plague. The bacterium Yersinia pestis had been humanity's silent companion for centuries, existing in marmots, ground squirrels, and other rodents across Eurasia. But something shifted in those mountain valleys around 1338. Climate variations, human intrusion, or perhaps simply the law of mutation created the right conditions for this microbe to jump from animal hosts into the bloodstream of human history. The plague's westward journey followed the same trade routes that had enriched civilizations for centuries, the paths now known as the Silk Road. These ancient roads were the medieval version of the modern internet, a vast system connecting distant regions of the world. Just as our digital highways spread knowledge and computer viruses across continents within seconds, these routes carried both prosperity and disease. The same networks that once brought luxury goods, new ideas, and cultural exchange to countless cities now became the roads of destruction. The same interconnectedness that had allowed Europe to flourish would now facilitate its collapse. The plague, beginning in China in the early to mid-1300s, spread along trade routes westward, carried by merchants who had no idea they transported death alongside their cargo. Mongol traders and warriors, moving through their territories, carried more than horses, furs, and silver. The disease was brought into Crimea by Mongol forces and merchants, where Europe would first face it. The great trading city of Kaffa, modern-day Feodosia, became the gateway for Europe's encounter with the plague. Here unfolds one of the darkest episodes of history. In 1346, during the siege of Kaffa by Mongol armies, plague struck the besieging troops with devastating effect. The commander, faced with collapse, ordered the corpses of plague victims to be hurled over the city walls, perhaps the first instance of biological warfare in recorded history. A chronicler of the time wrote with horror that piles of the dead were thrown into the city, and the Christians could not hide or flee. The Genoese merchants in Kaffa, witnessing the city's collapse into chaos, decided to flee. They loaded their ships with what goods they could and sailed across the Black Sea, unknowingly carrying the invisible enemy. The black rats in the ship's holds, their fleas filled with Yersinia pestis, became the unwilling agents of Europe's darkest hour. When 12 Genoese galleys reached Messina in October 1347, the harbor master and townspeople who came to greet them saw a nightmare. Most of the sailors already lay dead across the decks. Those still alive were hardly recognizable as human beings. Their skin blackened, their lymph nodes grotesquely swollen, blood and pus seeping from their bodies. The Sicilian authorities, recognizing the danger but not knowing its true nature, ordered the ships to leave. But it was already too late. The plague had secured its foothold in Europe, and like water seeping through cracks in a dam, it would spread steadily through every fracture of medieval society. Picture Maria, a young mother living near the harbor of Messina. She saw those dreadful ships arrive, watched the officials order them away, and likely felt comforted that the danger was gone. Within 1 week, her husband was dead. Within 2 weeks, her children followed. By the end of the month, Maria herself lay in one of the mass graves hurriedly dug beyond the city walls. Her story, multiplied by millions, represents the human truth behind the statistics. From Sicily, the plague moved with grim precision, following the trade routes that tied together the Mediterranean world. By the start of 1348, it had reached the busy ports of Genoa and Venice, the commercial centers of medieval Europe. From there, it advanced along the old Roman roads, through river valleys, and across mountain passes, transforming every path of connection into a corridor of death. To grasp the scale of what came next, we must abandon the modern idea of slow change and imagine instead a world where catastrophe traveled with the speed of rumor and the certainty of the tide. At least a third of Europe's population, over 25 million people, died between 1347 and 1352, and new studies suggest the total may have been even greater. In some regions, mortality reached 60%. Paris, the greatest city north of the Alps, became a house of the dead. Chroniclers describe streets filled with bodies, churches overflowing with the departed, and the constant tolling of bells, until there were too few survivors left to ring them. One Parisian priest wrote to his brother, saying, "The city has become a tomb. We who survive walk among the dead and do not know if we shall join them by nightfall." The population of the city may have dropped from 200,000 to less than 100,000. In Florence, Giovanni Boccaccio saw the destruction of everything he had known as civilized life. His Decameron provides one of the clearest glimpses of the plague's social ruin. "How many brave men, how many noble ladies," he wrote, "breakfasted with their families, and that very night supped with their ancestors in the next world." Boccaccio also recorded how funeral customs disappeared completely, with bodies cast into mass graves like goods stowed in the hold of a ship. Imagine being a 13-year-old girl in Florence, someone Boccaccio might have known. Your family gone, your streets crowded with corpses. The bells of the churches, once marking the rhythm of daily life, now rang endlessly until no one remained to ring them. You wandered through neighborhoods where entire households had vanished, doors left open, gardens overgrown, with no one alive to tend them. This was the reality for thousands of children who lived through the first wave, left orphans in a world that had forgotten how to care for the living. London endured what medieval writers called the Great Mortality, turning the busy commercial capital into a deserted ghost city. The Thames, usually crowded with merchant ships, instead carried the bodies of plague victims downstream to the sea. Emergency cemeteries were opened at East Smithfield, where archaeologists later uncovered huge mass graves holding thousands of plague dead, many showing evidence of hurried burial and the familiar lesions of bubonic plague. Most haunting of all are the accounts from the smaller towns and villages that formed the foundation of medieval life. In these places, the plague's impact was often absolute. Whole communities simply disappeared, their farmland turning back into wilderness, their churches standing silent, their names preserved only in tax rolls and land documents. The village of Tusmore in Oxfordshire was left completely empty, its people either dead or fled. The psychological effects proved nearly as devastating as the physical losses. Normal bonds between humans collapsed before overwhelming death. Parents deserted plague-stricken children, husbands and wives fled from each other, priests refused to offer last rites. The Italian chronicler Matteo Vigliani wrote that neither kin nor friends remained to care for the sick or to bury the dead. This was not just cowardice, it was the total collapse of the social order under existential fear. Strange occurrences were reported alongside the plague's progress. Witnesses claimed to see mysterious figures in white robes moving through towns at night, marking houses with crosses to show where the disease would strike. French records tell that many swore they saw Death himself walking in the streets of Avignon, a tall figure in a dark cloak pointing toward homes marked for pestilence. Foul odors often appeared before the plague's arrival, stenches so unique that survivors could predict an outbreak days before the first deaths began. Medieval physicians, trained in the classical traditions that had guided medicine for centuries, found themselves powerless before the plague's fury. Their carefully built system of disease crumbled in front of Yersinia pestis. Imagine modern doctors suddenly confronting an alien sickness that ignored everything they believed about healing. Their knowledge became not only useless but harmful, because it gave false confidence. The plague appeared in 3 separate forms, each more horrifying than the last. Bubonic plague, the most common variety, revealed itself through buboes, swollen lymph nodes that could swell to the size of oranges, usually in the groin, armpits, or neck. Chroniclers of the time called these swellings God's tokens, divine signs that foretold certain death. A physician in Montpellier wrote, "The swellings rise suddenly, hard as stone, burning with fever. When they burst, the stench fills the room, and death follows within a few days." Pneumonic plague struck the lungs directly, forcing victims to cough blood and die within hours of the first signs. This form spread from person to person through breath alone. No fleas or rats were necessary. Entire families could be wiped out in one day when pneumonic plague appeared. Most dreaded of all was septicemic plague, when the bacteria invaded the bloodstream directly. Victims of this form often died so swiftly, sometimes within only a few hours, that they showed almost no external symptoms beyond the darkening of hands and feet that gave the disease its common name. This blackening of the skin created the horrifying vision of people who looked as though they were decaying while still alive. Medieval doctors tried everything in their medical arsenal. They prescribed complicated mixtures of herbs, used bloodletting to balance the body's humors, and burned sweet-smelling substances to cleanse the tainted air. Some advised drinking one's own urine, while others suggested applying crushed emeralds or powdered unicorn horn. These cures seem absurd to us today, but at the time they represented the height of medieval medical knowledge. Theriac, a legendary universal remedy containing dozens of ingredients, including viper flesh, was given at immense cost. It was the medieval equivalent of experimental cancer drugs, desperately expensive treatments attempted when traditional medicine fails. None of these measures succeeded. The collapse of accepted medicine created a crisis that reached far beyond the practice of healing. If the trained physicians, with their Latin texts and university degrees, could not explain or cure the plague, what other pillars of medieval life might also prove hollow? In a world where disasters were viewed as acts of divine will, the plague's unprecedented devastation required explanations just as extraordinary. Christians of the Middle Ages struggled to understand what sin could be so immense as to bring such punishment. Many concluded that humanity itself had become so corrupt that God had chosen to begin anew, just as he had with Noah's flood. Flagellant groups marched across Europe, bands of penitents moving from town to town, scourging themselves bloody in public squares while crying out for repentance. A German chronicler described these processions. They came singing hymns of death and redemption, their backs torn with wounds they had given themselves, calling all to repent before the Last Judgment. These gatherings, though meant to appease divine anger, often became superspreader events that carried plague into new communities. The hunt for scapegoats grew fiercer as deaths multiplied. European Jews, already excluded from much of society, were accused of causing the plague by grotesque conspiracies. Though Jews died in equal numbers to Christians, rumors spread that they had poisoned wells or made pacts with demons to destroy Christendom. Entire Jewish communities were burned alive in France and Germany, their possessions seized by rulers. This revealed something troubling about human behavior under pressure: the tendency to prefer an evil that can be understood over a disaster that cannot. A supposed Jewish conspiracy, however absurd, gave the illusion of human control. It implied that the plague had visible causes and could therefore be stopped through visible actions, even if those actions were monstrous. One Jewish merchant from Strasbourg, before his community was wiped out, left testimony. "We die as you die, we weep as you weep, yet you accuse us of creating this misery. What madness has seized the world that suffering multiplies itself with hatred?" As mortality soared beyond anything in known history, the institutions of medieval society began to collapse. The feudal order, built on personal bonds between lord and vassal, could not survive when death struck both master and servant alike. Entire noble families disappeared in a night, leaving their vast estates without heirs. The Church, Europe's most stable institution, was both overwhelmed by demands for service and devastated by the loss of its own clergy. Priests and monks who ministered to the sick and gave last rites perished in even greater numbers than the general people. Entire monasteries were left empty, their centuries of learning abandoned. Economic life nearly stopped. Markets that had operated since Roman days ceased to function. The complex network of loans, trade, and production that had supported medieval prosperity unraveled as quickly as plague spread through a single home. Italian banking houses that had financed entire kingdoms collapsed when their agents across Europe perished faster than new ones could be trained. In many places, even the basic human duty to bury the dead became impossible. Mass graves were dug on the outskirts of every major town, and when these were filled, corpses were burned on great pyres or simply left to decay where they had fallen. The sight of the unburied dead, more than any other single factor, convinced many survivors that the final days had truly come. Most disturbing of all, even the most essential social bonds, between parent and child, husband and wife, broke apart under the weight of fear. Boccaccio himself recorded the unimaginable. Brother deserted brother, nephew his uncle, sister her brother, and often husband his wife. Even worse, and scarcely believable, fathers and mothers abandoned their own children, untended, unvisited, left to die as though they were strangers. When the plague at last began to fade in the early 1350s, not because of human effort but simply because it had killed so many possible hosts, the Europe that reemerged was permanently altered. The demographic collapse shattered the old order so completely that restoration was no longer possible. Adaptation was the only path forward. Labor, suddenly scarce after centuries of abundance, took on unprecedented worth. Peasants who survived found themselves in a position unthinkable before the plague. They could demand terms from their lords. A petition from one English peasant shows this new reality. "My lord, the fields lie fallow, not for want of seed, but for want of hands. If you desire grain, you must offer more than custom demands." The Statute of Laborers, issued by the English Parliament in 1351, tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, but economic necessity proved stronger than law. The Church, stripped of much of its clergy and facing deep questions about divine justice, entered periods of reform. People who had seen learned theologians die as helplessly as the simplest peasants began to turn toward direct spiritual experience rather than institutional guidance. Intellectually, the plague marked the beginning of the end for medieval faith in absolute truth. If even the learned authorities could not explain or prevent such disaster, then perhaps knowledge itself required a new foundation. Art and literature became more focused on death. The dance of death grew into a popular image, showing skeletons leading every rank of society, popes and peasants, kings and merchants, in an endless dance toward the grave. The plague also reshaped European medicine, creating greater emphasis on observation and evidence rather than ancient authorities. The Black Death destroyed the belief that humanity stood above the forces of nature, instead revealing us as living beings bound to the same laws as all creatures on Earth. Yet the story is not only one of defeat, but also of resilience. The Europe that rose again was smaller in numbers, but perhaps more energetic, more questioning, more aware of both limits and possibilities. A letter from a survivor in post-plague Paris expressed this double legacy. We who remain are fewer, but perhaps wiser. We have seen the worst fate can bring, and still we plant seeds for the coming harvest. If this is not hope, what is? Today, as we face challenges of our own, the Black Death gives both warning and inspiration. It reminds us that human civilization, however great its achievements, remains fragile. But it also proves that societies can endure even the worst disasters, emerging transformed, yet not destroyed. The Black Death was indeed humanity's greatest encounter with mortality, but in its aftermath it revealed our greatest strength: the will to survive, to change, and to build anew after staring into the abyss.